So welcome to the second session of our symposium. Paul Boghossian will be the main speaker, and then there will be comments in the following order: Roberto Peach, Ram Netta, and Paulo Faria, and then a response by Paul.
Thank you. So my topic today is epistemic relativism. As I'm sure everybody here is aware, many academics these days are attracted to relativistic views of knowledge. Not so much in philosophy, perhaps, but in very vast stretches of the humanities and social sciences. Now, sometimes this takes the form of a relativism about truth, and sometimes a relativism about justification. In any case, there is a kind of widespread suspicion out there that what counts as knowledge in one broadly cultural setting need not count as knowledge in another. And I want to discuss today what we should say about relativistic views of justification, the form of relativism about knowledge that I find most interesting and challenging. I think it's common to find relativistic views dismissed in analytic philosophy. I think that's ultimately the right verdict, though I am impressed by how tricky the questions are, and I think that we stand to learn a great deal from a more detailed examination of the issues involved in talking about epistemic relativism. There are many, many things. This is a long paper as it is. I'm going to try to abbreviate it as I go along. And one of the things that makes this issue very difficult is that you have to say a lot of things preliminarily, and I won't really have time to do that, but many of them may come up in the discussion. Very briefly, I take it that we aim to have true beliefs and that we attempt to satisfy that aim by having justified beliefs. And to achieve this aim of having justified beliefs, we modify our beliefs in accord with various epistemic rules. For instance, a rule about observation, that if the lighting is good and certain other conditions are met, then if it visually seems to you if there's a cat in front of you, then believe there's a cat in front of you. And in using this rule to arrive at justified beliefs, we implicitly commit ourselves to the truth of certain normative corresponding normative epistemic principles, namely if you're in good lighting and conditions are met, then if it visually seems to you that P, then you'd be justified in believing that P, where that is a normative epistemic principle. So clearly we accept a number of such rules, and of course there's much debate about exactly what they are, whether they are internalist in character or externalist in character, and so on. For the record, I'm an internalist about these rules, but I think at least some of the discussion won't depend on exactly how you go on those questions. These corresponding epistemic principles cover the relation between observation and justified belief, transmission of justification across inductive and deductive reasoning, inference of just explanation, and so forth. Now, some of the norms that we accept will be derived from other norms that we accept, and others, though, will be fundamental. In the case of the fundamental norms, the way I'm using the term, we won't be able to explain our acceptance of them on the basis of our acceptance of other epistemic norms. So I will call the totality of the fundamental epistemic principles to which a thinker is committed his epistemic system, and the corresponding totality of rules his epistemic practice. Against this backdrop, roughly, a realist about justification holds that there is an objective, practice-independent fact of the matter as to which epistemic principles are true, and so a fact of the matter as to which rules a thinker ought to employ if she is to arrive at beliefs that are genuinely justified. By contrast, a relativist will hold that there is no objective fact of the matter about which epistemic principles are true. So, to introduce such a view in more detail, let's listen to Richard Rorty explaining why it was not irrational of Cardinal Bellarmine. I guess this example is especially appropriate in Pontifical University, for Cardinal Bellarmine to look through Galileo's telescope to see for himself the evidence that the universe is not Ptolemaic. What Rorty says is that, as you may know, Galileo's telescope revealed lots and lots of evidence that Copernicanism was true, but the good cardinal refused to look through the telescope, saying that he had a far better source of evidence about the makeup of the heavens, namely the Holy Scripture itself. And commenting on this, Rorty says, it's on the handout, but can we then find a way of saying that the considerations advanced against Copernican theory by Cardinal Bellarmine, the scriptural description of the fabric of the heavens, were illogical or unscientific? Bellarmine defended his view by saying that he had excellent independent scriptural evidence for believing that the heavens were roughly Ptolemaic. Was his evidence brought in from another sphere, and was his proposed restriction of scope thus unscientific? What determines that Scripture is not an excellent source of evidence for the way the heavens are set up? And Rorty answers his own question as follows. So the question about whether Bellarmine was bringing in extraneous unscientific considerations seems to me to be a question about whether there is some antecedent way of determining the relevance of one statement to another, some grid, to use Foucault's term, which determines what sorts of evidence there could be for statements about the movement of planets. Obviously, he continues, the conclusion I wish to draw is that the grid which emerged in the later 17th and 18th centuries was not there to be appealed to in the early 17th century at the time that Galileo was on trial. No conceivable epistemology, no study of the nature of human knowledge could have discovered it before it was hammered out. The notion of what it was to be scientific was in the process of being formed. Now, I think in these arresting passages, Rorty is expressing the central tenets of what you might call a constructivist relativist view of justified belief. Epistemic systems are constructed by human thinkers at particular points in time. Bellarmine and Galileo are operating with fundamentally different epistemic systems. They employ different grids for determining what sort of evidence there could be for statements about the movement of planets. However, there is no objective fact of the matter as to which of these systems is correct, a fact that some epistemology might have discovered. Of course, having come to adopt Galileo's system, we now reject Bellarmine's and we call it unscientific and illogical. According to Rorty, however, this is just a sophisticated form of name-calling. All we're doing is expressing our preference for Galileo's system and rejecting Bellarmine. If our epistemic judgments are to have any prospect of being true, according to this Rortian picture, we should not claim that some belief is justified, punct, that is absolutely, but only that it's justified relative to this or that epistemic system, none of which better reflects the objective facts about justification than any other system. Now, Rorty doesn't go in detail into exactly how we should characterize the epistemic system that Bellarmine is said to be operating with, but I suppose a plausible description would attribute to him something like the principle I call revelation. For any P believed P is the revealed word of God is claimed by the Bible. Now, a second classic example in the literature on epistemic relativism concerns the Azande of Central Africa. The Azande, as most will be aware, have an elaborate theory of the practice of witchcraft by which they explain why misfortunes happen to people. There are many details, and as I say, I'm abbreviating here considerably, but for my purposes, I want to focus on the fact that the Azande believe both that witches are male members of the community, that being a witch consists in having a certain kind of substance, which in fact can be discovered by post-mortem, but and that this witchcraft substance is inherited patrilineally. Now, it would seem to follow from this that one clear-cut case of witchcraft identification is all it would take to establish that an entire lineage of people have been or will be witches. The reasoning would proceed by modus ponens, right? If X is a witch, then all of X's male descendants are witches. X is a witch, let's suppose, concerned independently. Therefore, all of these male descendants must be witches as well. But apparently, the Azande do not accept these inferences. They accept only that close paternal kinsmen of the known witch are also witches. And many scholars have concluded from this that the Azande employ a different logic from ours, one that involves rejecting unqualified use of modus ponens. Now let's accept for now, I say, the claim that the Grande and the Vatican circa 1630 represent the use of fundamentally different epistemic systems. Under fixed evidential circumstances, they yield conflicting verdicts on whether certain propositions are to be believed. Here as elsewhere, though, diversity is one thing and relativism is another. Epistemic relativism requires not just that there be alternative epistemic practices, but that there are no practice-independent facts that make one system correct and the other one wrong. So call this view epistemic non-factualism. Epistemic relativism proposes to accommodate epistemic non-factualism by saying that if our epistemic judgments are to have any prospect of being true, they should be relativized to epistemic systems. Okay? And that's the view that I've described under one, relativism and justification. Now, there are many prima facie puzzling aspects of this formulation of epistemic relativism, but I propose not to dwell on them now, but to come back to them after we've had a chance to appreciate the positive case that can be made in favor of epistemic relativism. And in my view, the strongest possible case can be constructed as follows. It's really a case for epistemic non-factualism, and it goes like this. That's under 5. If there are objectively true epistemic principles, it must be possible to arrive at justified beliefs about what they are. It is not possible to arrive at justified beliefs about which epistemic principles are objectively true. Therefore, there are no objectively true epistemic principles. The argument is evidently valid. The only question is whether it's sound, and so I now want to look at the premises. Let's begin with the first. Now, if there are objective facts about which epistemic principles are true, it ought to be possible to arrive at justified beliefs about what they are. This is not the strong and implausible claim that if a subject is to know anything, including very ordinary things, then he must know the epistemic principles that underlie his claim to knowledge. Right? I'm perfectly happy to allow that one may know all sorts of ordinary facts about the world before knowing anything about epistemic principles, and then bring that knowledge to bear on the knowledge of the epistemic principles. All that really is being insisted on in the first premise is that it be possible to arrive at justified views about what the epistemic principles are. And this much weaker claim, of course, seems eminently plausible. Indeed, in doing epistemology, we assume not only that they're knowable, but that they're knowable a priori. It would be peculiar, to say the least, if we suppose that there are facts about whether seeing a cat justifies believing that there is a cat, but that such facts are necessarily inaccessible to creatures such as ourselves. We're implicitly assuming that we know what those facts are. Let's suppose we concede this. Why should we grant the argument's second premise that such facts will not be knowable? Well, consider a situation in which the question whether we know the facts in question arises. That is, we encounter Bellarmine or the Grande, and they question the correctness of our epistemic system. They say we're employing the wrong epistemic principles, and we think the same of them. If there really were a fact of the matter here, shouldn't we be able to settle it one way or the other? How, though, could we go about showing them the error of their ways? To show them, or ourselves for that matter, that our system is right and theirs wrong, we would have to justify the principles of our system over theirs. But justifying a claim requires using an epistemic system. Which system should we use? Well, naturally, we would use ours. We take ours to be the right system. We think theirs is mistaken. That's exactly what we're trying to show. We could hardly hope to show that we're justified in thinking that our system is correct by justifying it with the use of a system that doesn't yield justified verdicts. But also, naturally, they would use their system to decide which of us is right. Now, suppose that we discover that our own rules decide in favor of themselves and against the other practice. This is not exactly a foregone conclusion, since some sets of rules will be self-undermining, ruling against themselves, and others may well be tolerant of some degree of divergence. But it's a very likely outcome for any sufficiently well-developed epistemic practice. On that scenario, then, we will have two self-supporting practices that are at odds with each other. Will anything substantive been shown? Well, could we really claim, in other words, to have shown that, that our principles are correct and theirs incorrect? If we persist in calling the other practitioners wrong, aren't we simply insisting on the superiority of our practice over theirs? Now, I think there are two different ways of hearing the charge that that's all we're doing, and so two different ways of responding to it. One can hear it as saying, well, look, I did in fact show the correctness of my system over theirs, but unfortunately I am not able to bring them around. They're simply too far gone. My justification may be dialectically ineffective against them, but that's their problem. This is what Juan was referring to earlier this morning. This is what Juan was referring to earlier this morning when he said, in this kind of case of epistemic circularity, you're going to get dialectical ineffectiveness against an opponent who's starting off doubting the system that you're using. But I think to just say that would be to underestimate the predicament that the objectivist about justification is in. And this connects up with what Ernie said when he said, well, what Fumerton says is it won't break his bone. I think there is a perfectly good sense in which, in that kind of situation, the person will not have shown anything about the correctness of his preferred system, even by his own lights, and not just by the lights of his opponent. That is, the point is that it looks to be something that we ourselves seem to acknowledge, is that there is no interesting sense in which we could have shown the correctness of an epistemic system by using that very system. And it's interesting anticipation of my paper, because I quote Rich Fumerton, who says, there is no philosophically interesting notion of justification or knowledge that would allow us to use a kind of reasoning to justify the legitimacy of that very reasoning. If this is right, and I'm not saying that it is, but I want to try to put forward the strongest possible case for the relativist at this point. If this is right, then it looks as though even by our own lights, we cannot hope to settle the question which epistemic system is correct once it has been raised. We consequently seem to have to concede that if there are objective facts about justification, those facts are in principle unknowable. And with that, the relativist argument goes through. The most that any epistemic practice will be able to say when confronted by an alternative, self-supporting epistemic practice is that it is correct by its own lights, whereas the alternative isn't, but that cannot yield a justification of the one practice over the other without begging the question. If the point is to decide which of the two practices is better than the other, self-certification is not going to help. Each side will be able to provide a rule-circular justification of its own practice. Neither side will be able to provide anything more. With what right, then, could either party claim to have a superior conception of rational or justified belief? We seem to be left no choice but to say with Wittgenstein, if I've exhausted the justifications, I have reached bedrock and my spade is turned, then I'm inclined to say, this is simply what I do. Now, let me turn to considering whether we could, in principle, conclude from this argument that epistemic relativism is true in the way that it's described. One thing that people have always thought is problematic about epistemic relativism has been very nicely expressed by Nagel in his recent book, and I quote that under 7 of the handout. I'm sorry, not under 7, under 8. He says, look, the claim, he's using everything is subjective to me, everything is relativized to an epistemic system. The claim everything is subjective must be nonsense, for it would itself have to be either subjective or objective, but it can't be objective, since in that case it would be false if true, and it can't be subjective because then it would not rule out any objective claim, including the claim that it's objectively false. Let me translate this kind of self-refutation argument into terms that are more directly relevant to the epistemic case we're considering, and that's done under 9. roughly what Nagel is saying: the claim nothing is objectively justified, but only justified relative to this or that epistemic system must be nonsense, for it would itself have to be either objectively justified or only justified relative to this or that particular epistemic system. But it can't be objectively justified, since in that case it would be false if true, and it can't be justified only relative to the relativist epistemic system, since in that case it's just a report of what he finds it agreeable to say. If he also invites us to join him, we need not offer any reason for declining, since he has offered us no reason to accept. Now, I think the flaw in this argument, this very traditional argument against relativism, is in the argument against the subjectivist horn. That is, if the relativist opts for saying that relativism is justified only relative to his principles, it doesn't immediately follow that he is just saying what he finds it agreeable to say. Indeed, it doesn't even follow that he is saying that relativism is justified only relative to epistemic principles that are unique to relativists. For all we are entitled to assume, he may mean that relativism is justified by a set of principles that are endorsed by relativists and non-relativists alike. So we're not immediately entitled to say, as Nagel does, that if the relativist opts for this horn, we're entitled to ignore him. Indeed, as we've just seen, the pro-relativist argument of the previous section relies on only two assumptions. First, that in evaluating an epistemic system, there is no alternative but to use some system or other. And second, that there is no interesting notion of justification that will allow us to justify a form of reasoning through the use of that very form of reasoning. And both assumptions not only seem incontestable, but are very widely accepted. So it's not as though when the relativist puts forward his position, he's just saying something that he finds it agreeable to say and that has absolutely no hold on us. It's got a hold on us. But I do think that it is not possible to accept an epistemic relativism. And I want to offer a different diagnosis from the one that this traditional self-refutation argument. The real problem, in my view, is not so much that we can't find a formulation of the view that would give us a reason to accept it, but that it's impossible to see how we might coherently come to adopt a relativist view of our own epistemic practice. According to the relativists, this is now under 10 of the handout, however much we may be inclined to say things like percent belief B is justified by evidence E, we should really only say or think thoughts of the form star, belief B is justified by E relative to system C, for these are the only kinds of truths that there are in the immediate vicinity. In forming beliefs, however, we cannot make do with judgments of form star. To see why, consider the confrontation with Bellarmine and suppose we're all convinced of relativism. So I'm now no longer prepared to say, A, Copernicanism is justified, but only B, Copernicanism is justified relative to my epistemic system, call it science. And Bellarmine, for his part, is no longer prepared to say Copernicanism is justified, but only Copernicanism is unjustified relative to my epistemic system, call it Vatican. The trouble is that if we're restricted to those two propositions, we can no longer explain why I believe Copernicanism and why Bellarmine rejects it. That is, after all, I agree with D that Copernicanism is unjustified relative to his epistemic system, Vatican. And he agrees with B. I agree that Copernicanism is unjustified relative to Vatican, and he agrees that it's justified relative to science. Those relational facts about the epistemic status of Copernicanism are not in dispute. What divides us, rather, is what it would be justified to believe. Punkt, the very thought that the relativist proposes to ban. However, if we're barred from thinking such thoughts, it's entirely unclear how we are to explain why we believe one thing rather than another. So the idea is epistemic relativism is not, of course, meant to be the view that we might call irrationalism, according to which we're simply incapable of possessing epistemic reasons for believing one thing as opposed to another. The epistemic relativist doesn't deny that we can have reasons for believing one thing as opposed to another. He maintains only that what reasons we have depends on which epistemic practices we employ. And that's a good thing because irrationalism does look to be an obviously self-defeating position. But what I'm arguing, though, is that it is ultimately impossible for the relativist to distinguish himself from the irrationalist. I cannot think that I have a reason for believing something, Copernicanism for example, just by thinking relational thoughts like Copernicanism is justified relative to science. I also have to think, and science is the right epistemic system by which to fix belief. And that is the very thought that relativism wishes to abolish. Now, the relativist may reply that all that's needed in order for relativism not to lapse into irrationalism is some form of commitment by the thinker to his epistemic system. It needn't be a commitment to the system's objective correctness. For example, most ordinary persons are strongly attached to the norms of etiquette by which they live, for example, to the norm not to pick one's nose at the dinner table. But that doesn't mean that people have a commitment to the objective correctness of their norms of etiquette. They just would never want to do things any other way. Why shouldn't something similar be true of epistemic norms? Well, I think it's true that, as our imagined relativist is claiming, that etiquette supplies an example of commitment to a set of norms that is not a commitment to their objective correctness. We're committed to our norms of etiquette in the sense that we would find it very hard to give them up in favor of another set, especially if called upon to do so abruptly. And yet surely no reasonably enlightened person thinks that their norms of etiquette are objectively correct, that any community employing a different set of norms must be making some sort of error. Whatever this notion of commitment is, why couldn't our commitment to our epistemic norms be something similar? Well, the answer, I think, is that our commitment to certain norms of etiquette is a commitment to certain aesthetic preferences. Preferences about the sort of person one wants to be, and the sort of person one wants to be, or sort of people one wants to be with. It's easy to make sense of the sort of commitment that's characteristic of etiquette because it's easy to make sense of the sort of hold that aesthetic preferences can have on us, even in the absence of a commitment to their objective correctness. It's hard to see, however, how to transfer such an explanation from the sphere of etiquette to that of epistemic justification, for there's no interesting sense in which our epistemic norms could be said to reflect anything about us, other than our desire to arrive at genuinely justified beliefs about the world. The only rationale for employing rules like observation, modus ponens, and so forth, as opposed to others, is that they're taken to represent the most reasonable way of arriving at the truth. But if that rationale cannot serve as the basis on which to prefer them to various alternatives, why should we feel any particular attachment to them at all? In sum, then, in forming beliefs, we have no option but to think of ourselves as trying to figure out how things stand with the world. That means that any consideration that we take to be a reason for belief must be thought of as evidence in favor of its truth. If, however, we are epistemic relativists, and we think of the epistemic rules by which we are to decide whether a given belief is justified as no better at yielding justified belief than any alternative set, and that implies that we cannot ever take ourselves to have good evidence for any belief because we cannot take the verdict yielded by our epistemic rules to be any better than the verdict that would be yielded by some competing set of rules. Hence, we cannot ever take ourselves to have succeeded at a name that is non-optional for belief, namely to arrive at beliefs that are justified. Punkt. Now, there are any number of moves available to the relativist here, all of which require abandoning the letter of the view as formulated, but I don't think they can ultimately save it, and we can discuss some of this in the discussion period. If I'm right that relativism is not a viable way of responding to the argument for epistemic non-factualism that I gave, then either there is some other, let's say, expressivist way of accommodating that non-factualism, or there better be some way of diffusing the appearance that that argument really does support epistemic non-factualism. Now, let me just say that I don't believe that expressivist ways of accommodating the non-factualism should work. This is the kind of move that is tried by Alan Gibbard, although he doesn't really work it out in the case of systemology. But here is not the place to go into that. So I am committed to finding a way of diffusing the appearance that the argument from epistemic circularity and the standoff between competing practices that I gave really does support epistemic non-factualism. And in the remainder of this talk, what I'd like to do is start on what I take to be a quite complicated task of undercutting the argument and its